But let's talk about that afternoon symposium. So, a few months before the event, you both were invited to choose one particular topic of your interest and deliver a paper, short paper, maybe 15, 20 minutes. The other person would have a chance to respond, and then there would be roundtable discussion among the symposium attendees. Now, you chose the topic of divine simplicity. And I remember when we had breakfast with Dr. Craig the morning of the event, and he seemed very just confused and surprised that you would choose this topic. And in his typical gentlemanly demeanor at the end of breakfast, he said, "Hey, can I just say one more thing?" And he kind of leaned in and said, "Now, I just want you to know that I'm going to disagree with you on this topic. I hope that's okay." And he said, "Of course it's okay. I expected that." Well, why'd you choose that topic, and why is it so important?
Well, I'll tell you, for me, anyone that's read my books or articles knows that this idea of God's simplicity, that in God essence and existence coincide, that God is not one being among many, but rather to be God is to be to be. I mean, all of that business that is rooted in Thomas Aquinas and before Thomas Aquinas in the patristic tradition, that this idea is a hinge idea for me. In fact, when I was doing the John Paul II chapel at Mundelein, and we had these new stained glass windows put in, and we had one of Thomas Aquinas, and I told the artist, I said, I want him to be holding the Summa, and I want it to be open to the clarification in the first part of the Summa where he mentions that in God, essence and existence coincide, because I think it's the distinctive quality of God, if you want. It's the way to name what makes God God. And then everything else in our Catholic theology flows in some ways from that idea. So to me, it's fundamental, it's basic, which is why I was so surprised now some years ago when I discovered that William Lane Craig, whom I deeply admire, I think he's dead right about arguing for God's existence and all that, disagreed strenuously with this idea, based on largely the speculation of Alvin Plantinga, who's a contemporary evangelical, theologian, philosopher rather than theologian. But I was just so taken by that and sort of puzzled by it that it led me to read a lot more in Craig. And I just thought, well, listen, if we're going to talk about something, let's talk about something I think is very important that you disagree with.
So in your paper, you sort of outlined what the divine simplicity means. It doesn't mean, by the way, that God is simple in the sense that he's simple to understand. I remember, Bishop, by the way, on a side note, in Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, this is the one doctrine that he goes at full force, and he seems to suggest that he can disprove God, which has been classically understood to be divinely simple, because God's must be enormously complex to have designed this world, so therefore God doesn't exist. But anyway, you lay out the doctrine of divine simplicity. You anticipated some of the common objections, but how did William Lane Craig respond to it? What were some of his major objections to your paper?
Yeah, he enunciated a lot of things he's written about before, namely that it seems to be very unbiblical, that the God of the Bible seems to be a very definite being, who has ideas and moods and who acts and so on. And the divine simplicity can seem to give the impression that God is more like an abstract entity or like a Buddhist abyss or something. So there was a biblical objection that you can't reconcile this idea of God with the Bible. It's a kind of a technical point, but it seems to conflate all the attributes of God into one. And it's true that in Aquinas, the way that God, in God, essence and existence coincide means that God's intelligence, God's will, God's power, God's love, etc., all are really different ways of naming the same reality, which is the very essence of God. And so it seems to conflate these things, which are, at least by our common intuition, separate. Another problem, again, kind of a technical point, is that there's what they call the modal collapse. What they mean by that is, if you say God is simple, that to be God is to be, it seems to indicate a sort of necessitarianism, that God can't be any different than he is. So, for example, could you say, well, God might not have created? Well, yeah, okay, sure. God might have made a world different than the one he made. Yeah, I guess that's right. But see, in those cases, there would be worlds in which God remains God, but yet certain things are different. And that seems to indicate there's an accidental quality to God's way of being, see? And that makes God into a very big instance of the kind of beings that we experience all the time. So right now, you're in Orlando, you could be in California. I'm in Philadelphia, I could be in Chicago. So you and I remain the same, even though they're different modal possibilities. See? But if our essence and existence simply coincide, that sort of modal differentiation seems to be ruled out of court. Anyway, those are the standard objections that Craig would raise. And as I mentioned, they're grounded in the speculation of Alvin Plantinga, this contemporary Protestant philosopher. Now, I'll say a couple quick things, which I said at the symposium. First of all, the biblical problem. I think it's so often overlooked that Aquinas was a deeply biblical figure. His basic task as a professor of theology in medieval Paris was to preach, predicatio, preaching. Well, if you're a preacher, you have to be a Bible commentator, right? Because preachers preach on the Bible. And indeed, Thomas does lots of Bible commentaries, including that masterpiece on the Gospel of John. Well, if you're a Bible commentator, you're going to see all the questions, anomalies, conundrums, problems that arise from a careful reading of the Bible, right? And that leads you to raise what the medievals called questiones disputate, disputed questions. Well, I mean, it seems that God doesn't change because it says here, but elsewhere in the Bible, it certainly seems that God does change. So how do you handle that? It seems that we're free, but on the other hand, if God has complete providence, it seems that we can't be free, So theology arises out of biblical commentary. Then Thomas Aquinas wanted to summarize all those disputed questions into, at least for him, relatively readable and accessible material. And hence we get the famous summae, summaries of theology, right? My point there is most, even specialists in Aquinas, tend to read only the summaries, and they forget the very deep biblical background to all that he's saying. So that's part of the biblical thing. The identification of the properties is a very interesting problem in philosophy and theology. It is indeed true that for Aquinas, all the things that we name as different, for example, God's intelligence, his will, his power, his love, are really the same reality. They're just different ways of naming, according to our perception, the one divine essence. And the image to use here, I think it's an illuminating image, is the white light in a prism, right? Think of a white light. But when it passes through a prism, it breaks into a variety of colors. So think of finite consciousness as a kind of prism. So when the divine light shines on our finite consciousness, it breaks into a variety of colors. And we name them as, there's the divine intelligence, there's the divine will, the divine power. But they are, in fact, different ways of naming the white light, which is the divine essence. So that's a way to handle the problem of the properties. The modal problem is, again, even more subtle, and it depends upon an important distinction between the fact that the world is really related to God. That means, in Thomas's parlance, that the world is causally dependent upon God. But God is not really related to the world. It doesn't mean he's indifferent to the world. It means he's not causally dependent upon it, which further entails that even in a wide variety of modal differentiations, God's essence is not changed or modified. So would God still be God in the full sense if he had never created? Sure. Would God be God in the full sense if he had made a different world? Sure. Because God is not really related to the world in the sense of causal dependency. Okay. To get the full picture here, listen to the symposium, because these are all complex sort of philosophical issues. A lot of it, by the way, though, Brandon, hinges upon that 13th and 14th century shift from an analogical conception of being to a univocal conception of being in people like Duns Scotus and William of Ockham. The Protestant reformers were very influenced by that thought world. And you see it. We saw it around the table that day in Claremont, is the Protestant thinkers almost all went with Craig along the univocal path. The Catholics all went with Aquinas along the analogical path. And that's, to me, was very interesting, very illuminating. So way behind, justification and sacraments and the Pope and all the 16th century things, there's this more fundamental demarcation between an analogical and a univocal conception of being. Anyway, so that's what I found so fascinating about the afternoon session.